January 11, 1944, 21,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. The temperature outside the canopy is 50 degrees below zero. The air is too thin to breathe without an oxygen mask. A single P-51 Mustang banks hard into a sky filled with enemy fighters. Not 3 or 4. More than 30. The pilot has already lost his wingman. He has already lost his entire squadron. There is no one else coming. Below him, a formation of B-17 bombers is being torn apart, one aircraft at a time, by German fighters who know exactly what they are doing. The pilot could turn for home right now. Every rule he has ever been taught says he should. Instead, he rolls his Mustang over and dives straight into the swarm. His name is James Howard. 3 years earlier, he was flying a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk over Burma, painted with a shark's grin, fighting for the Flying Tigers. Now he is 30 years old, a squadron commander, flying an aircraft some of his own men still do not trust. For the next 30 minutes, alone, he will do something so difficult to believe that 16 separate bomber crews will write it down independently. Certain no one will believe just one. When it is over, he will become the only fighter pilot in the entire European theater of the Second World War to receive the Medal of Honor. History remembers him as a one-man Air Force. James Howell Howard was born in 1913 in Canton, China. His father was an American doctor, an ophthalmologist who had crossed the Pacific to teach eye surgery to Chinese physicians. For the first 14 years of his life, James grew up far from the cornfields and courthouses, squares that most of his future squadron mates would call home. He grew up in the sounds of a foreign port city, the smell of coal smoke and river water, the calls of merchants along the docks in a language his American relatives back home could not understand. He watched junks and steamers share the same crowded harbor. He watched, without fully understanding it yet, a country that was already quietly sliding toward war with its neighbor across the sea. When Howard was 11 years old, he and his father were kidnapped by Manchurian bandits, held for 10 weeks in the interior of a country that most Americans of that era could not have found on a map. They eventually managed to escape. Whatever fear a young boy carried out of that experience, it did not stop him from returning to airplanes and to combat again and again for the next 50 years of his life. Decades later, men who served beside him would remark that Howard carried himself differently than other American officers, patient in a way that seemed to come from having grown up as an outsider, looking in on two worlds at once, never quite certain which one was truly his own. He had learned young what it meant to be surrounded by people who could not be trusted, and he had learned young what it meant to keep breathing anyway. His family eventually returned to the United States. He enrolled at Pomona College in California, a serious student, disciplined, the kind of young man professors remembered without being able to say exactly why. But something else had already taken hold of him. He wanted to fly. In 1937, he left college without finishing his degree and reported to the United States Navy's flight school in Pensacola, Florida. He earned his wings in 1939. His first assignment placed him with Fighting Squadron 3, the Flying Chiefs, launching off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, based out of Pearl Harbor. He flew the Grumman F-3F, a biplane fighter already approaching obsolescence, off a carrier that would one day become the most decorated ship in the United States Navy. He learned carrier landings the hard way, chasing a pitching deck across open ocean, judging his approach by feel as much as by instrument, a skill that would serve him again years later in the fog and mud of an English airfield. He learned formation discipline, the unforgiving mathematics of fuel and distance over water, where a single miscalculation meant a swim instead of a landing. Howard was there before any of it happened. He was there when Pearl Harbor was still just a harbor, when the battleships at anchor along Ford Island seemed as permanent as the mountains behind them. He walked those docks in the afternoons after training flights, ate at the officers' club, read the newspapers coming out of Tokyo, and made his own quiet judgments about what he was reading. He had lived in Asia. He knew that the war everyone in the American mainland believed was still far away, was, in fact, already breathing hot on the Pacific. In June of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor was anything but a naval base, Howard made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He resigned his Navy commission and signed on with an organization that officially did not exist as part of the United States military. It was called the American Volunteer Group. History would remember them by a nickname painted across their engine cowlings, a row of savage teeth beneath a single glaring eye: the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers were mercenaries in the most literal sense. American pilots quietly released from military service to fly Curtiss P-40 Warhawks in the service of a Chinese government fighting for its survival against Japan. Their contracts came through a civilian shell company. Their pay came in United States dollars. Their orders came from Claire Chennault, a retired American Army Air Corps officer who had been advising Chiang Shek's Air Force for years. Howard was assigned to the 2nd Squadron, the men who called themselves the Panda Bears. He flew out of airfields in Burma and southern China, intercepting Japanese bombers that had, until the Tigers arrived, flown largely unopposed. The P-40 was not a beautiful airplane. It was heavy. It climbed slowly, and above 20,000 feet, it struggled against the more nimble Japanese fighters it faced. The Flying Tigers compensated with tactics built around the airplane's actual strengths: diving attacks, heavy firepower, discipline instead of glory hunting. Never turn with a zero, Chennault warned his pilots repeatedly. Dive on him. Fire your burst. Break away and climb. Come back at him again on your terms. It was not glamorous. It worked. Howard flew 56 combat missions with the Tigers. He shot down 6 confirmed Japanese aircraft, enough to make him an ace before the United States had fired a single official shot of its own war in the Pacific. Life in Burma bore little resemblance to the polished airfields he would later know in England. Ground crews worked in heat that softened the tar on the runways, patching bullet holes and fabric control surfaces with whatever material they could scavenge, keeping tired engines running on fuel that was never quite the right grade. Howard flew from dirt strips carved out of the jungle, took off into skies with no radar warning of what was coming, and learned to read the specs on the horizon before anyone could confirm them by radio. At night, he slept in barracks that shook when the monsoon rains came down, ate rice and canned meat by the light of hurricane lamps, listened to Chinese and Burmese and English overlap around him in a way that reminded him, unmistakably, of the years in Canton. He learned something in Burma that Dana, no flight school, could have taught him. He learned what it felt like to be outnumbered, as a matter of routine. To look up and count enemy aircraft in numbers his own formation could not match, and to fight anyway because the alternative was watching bombers reach a city undefended. That lesson would return to him almost unchanged on a January afternoon over Germany 2 years later. The Flying Tigers were disbanded in July of 1942, absorbed into the regular United States Army Air Forces as America's own war effort expanded to meet them. Howard returned to the United States as a captain. The Army checked him out in the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning, then the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Within a year, he had been promoted to major and given command of the 356th Fighter Squadron, part of the 354th Fighter Group. The 354th was not an 8th Air Force unit, the way most of the famous American fighter groups over Europe were. It belonged to the 9th Air Force, the tactical arm of American air power in the theater. Its job on paper was to support ground operations. But in the winter of 1943, with the 8th Air Force desperate for a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Germany and back, the 354th had been loaned to the 8th for a mission its own doctrine had not yet caught up to. The group had crossed the Atlantic in the fall of 1943, arrived in England expecting the fighters they had trained on in the American West. Instead, they found something different waiting for them at the docks. Brand new P-51B Mustangs, fresh from the factory in California, fitted with the Merlin engine that the British had persuaded the Americans to adopt only months earlier. They gave themselves a nickname that carried a particular kind of pride: the Pioneer Mustang Group, because they were exactly that. The first American fighter unit in the entire European theater to fly the North American P-51 Mustang into combat. His new mount was neither the P-40 nor the P-38. It was a new fighter, so new that half of Europe still did not trust it. The North American P-51 Mustang had arrived in England amid a strange contradiction. On paper, it was the answer to a problem that had haunted American bomber crews for over a year. Fitted with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, in place of its original underpowered Allison, the Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and travel farther than any single-engine fighter the Allies had ever produced. With external drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into Germany and bring them home again, a feat no P-47 Thunderbolt or P-38 Lightning could manage under the same conditions. In practice, the airplane had a reputation problem. Its fuel system used multiple internal tanks that had to be managed and switched in careful sequence. Get the sequence wrong at altitude and the engine could starve for fuel at the worst possible moment. Its narrow landing gear made for unforgiving touchdowns on the muddy, pockmarked runways of wartime England. Pilots who had spent months learning to trust the rugged, radial-engined Thunderbolt, an airplane that famously flew home after absorbing damage that should have killed both engine and pilot, looked at the sleek, liquid-cooled Mustang and saw fragility. Some called it unforgiving. A few, only half-joking, called it a coffin with wings. Howard did not share the full weight of that skepticism. He had already flown 4 different fighter types across 2 theaters of war. He understood better than most of his younger pilots that an airplane's reputation and an airplane's true capability were often 2 very different things. Still, he inherited a squadron full of men who whispered about engine failures and blind spots behind the cockpit. Men who missed the comforting growl of a radial engine that could take a beating and keep running. In the officers' mess at night, over watered-down coffee and cigarettes, the arguments ran late. Pilots traded rumors of Mustangs that had gone down for no clear reason, engines that had simply stopped at altitude, canopies that fogged at the worst possible moment. Howard listened more than he spoke. He had heard similar arguments before about P-40 in Burma, an airplane the British had also considered second-rate, until pilots learned to fly it, its own terms instead of someone else's. Command meant convincing his men otherwise, one mission at a time, while quietly gathering his own evidence in the cockpit, logging the Mustang's climb rate, its turn radius, the altitude at which the Merlin engine still pulled hard when a German engine below him was already gasping for air. He named his own Mustang Ding Hao, 2 Chinese characters that had followed him out of Burma. The words meant something close to very good, or number 1. A phrase Chinese villagers had once shouted to the flying tigers as their fighters roared overhead. It was a small thing painted in white letters near the cockpit, but it was Howard's way of carrying 2 wars into one airplane. His P-51B carried the official designation P-51B5NA, tail number 436315. Squadron code AJ-A, the letters. AJ identified the 356th Fighter Squadron. The letter A identified this specific aircraft as the commanding officer's personal mount, a machine that in April of 1944 would be photographed at RAF Boxted in Essex, England, with its pilot standing beside it in his flying jacket, and that photograph, held today by the American Air Museum in Britain, would become one of the most reproduced images of an American fighter pilot in the Second World War. But the airplane in that photograph was still, In January of 1944, an unproven machine flown by a squadron that had barely begun to trust it, and the man beside it was still a major, not yet the lieutenant colonel he would become before spring. Through the winter of 1943 into 1944, the 354th Fighter Group flew escort missions deeper and deeper into German airspace, testing the Mustang's range mission by mission. The airplane performed. Fuel system quirks aside, it flew where the Thunderbolts could not follow, past the invisible line in the sky the Luftwaffe called the Death Zone, the point beyond which American bombers had always flown alone. For the first time, bombers approaching targets near Berlin itself had a fighter escort capable of staying with them the entire way. On the night of January the 10th, 1944, orders came down for a maximum effort mission. The following morning, the target was the AGO Flugzeugwerk, an aircraft factory at Oschersleben, deep inside Germany, where German workers were assembling Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, the very airplanes that would try to kill the bomber crews flying to destroy the factory that built them. A second force would strike Halberstadt. 3 full divisions of B-17 Flying Fortresses would make the run. Howard would lead 50 Mustangs of his own group as part of the escort. One of the deepest fighter penetrations into German territory attempted up to that point in the war. Howard briefed his pilots that night in a cold Nissen hut lit by hanging bulbs, the wind rattling the corrugated metal roof, condensation beating on the inside of the windows. He laid out the route on a map, pinned to a board, a red ribbon of string stretching from the English coast across the Channel, deep into the heart of Germany and back, laying out the rally points, the fuel margins that would leave almost no room for error. He did not know, standing in front of that map, that intelligence estimates would later place as many as 500 German fighters in the air over central Germany the following day, gathered to defend factories that mattered too much to lose. He did not know that by early afternoon he would be the only American fighter pilot standing between more than 30 of those fighters and a formation of bombers with no one else left to protect them. He only knew that the mission was long, the margins were thin, and morning was already close. Take satellite photograph of modern Oschersleben, and you would not know that anything of consequence had ever happened there. It is a small German town about 100 kilometers west of Berlin in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, with a population of just under 20,000 people. Small streets, a church, a river running through the middle of town. Zoom in on a section of open ground near the northern edge of the town. That is where the AGO Flugzeugwerke stood. In 1944, this was one of the most heavily defended pieces of industrial ground in all of Germany. Not because of what it looked like from the air. From the air, it looked like any other cluster of factory buildings, but because of what came out of it. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, some of the finest single-engine aircraft of the entire war, fast, well-armed, flown by pilots trained to hunt American bombers. Every Focke-Wulf assembled at Oschersleben was one more machine that would, within weeks, be climbing into the sky to shoot down American air crews. The math of it was unforgiving in both directions. Bomb the factory, and you shortened the life of every German fighter still to be built there. Fail to bomb the factory, and those fighters would be waiting for the next bomber formation, and the one after that, and the one after that. The Germans understood this arithmetic, as well as the Americans did, which is why, on the morning of January 11th, 1944, they gathered what would eventually be estimated as 500 fighters over central Germany, nearly the entire remaining strength of the Luftwaffe Home Defense Force in that region. Not to defend Berlin, to defend a small factory in a town no American had ever heard of, in a place where the loss of a single day's production would be felt, in the cockpits of Focke-Wulf 190s that would never be built to replace them. Think for a moment about what that concentration of German air power actually meant. 500 fighters gathered over a single stretch of German sky. enough aircraft to have blackened the horizon in every direction. If a man had been able to see them all at once, every one of them flown by a pilot with orders to bring down American bombers by whatever means necessary, every one of them fueled and armed and briefed at some German airfield in the hour before dawn, ready to take off on radio call and converge on the American formations as they came in. That was the sky James Howard would fly into that morning, not fully understanding, until he was already inside it, just how large a hornet's nest the 8th Air Force had disturbed. The route from England to Oschersleben was almost 800 miles round trip, well beyond the reach of the Thunderbolts and Lightnings that had escorted bomber formations through most of 1943, well beyond the reach of any Allied fighter, in fact, that did not carry the Merlin engine and the drop tanks that the Mustang was just beginning to prove could stretch a fighter's legs across the entire Reich. That meant that any bomber crew flying to Oschersleben was, for large portions of its mission, going to be at the mercy of whatever fighter escort could be scraped together. And the fighter escorts, in turn, would be operating at the far edge of their fuel range. Every minute spent maneuvering was a minute closer to running dry over hostile territory. The Mustang could, in theory, make the round trip. The Thunderbolts and Lightnings, assigned to earlier legs of the escort, would have to turn for home well before the target was reached, which meant that for the deepest and most dangerous portion of the raid, the bombers would be protected by whatever P-51s the 9th Air Force could put in the air. And in January of 1944, that meant primarily the 354th Fighter Group, Howard's group, 50 airplanes to cover more than 500 bombers. Those are the numbers to hold in your mind as this story unfolds. 50 against 500. Not 500 enemies, 500 friends whose lives depended on those 50 escorts staying in formation, staying in position, and staying together. The airplane that would be doing that work is worth understanding on its own terms. The P-51 Mustang that Howard flew was the B model, not the more famous D model that would become the icon of the strategic bombing campaign later in 1944. The B had a different canopy, a different armament configuration, and, in the version that Howard's squadron carried, 450 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. Not 6. The D model would add 2 additional guns later that year. But in January of 1944, when Howard climbed into Ding Hao before dawn, he had 4 guns and roughly 350 rounds of ammunition for each of them, 1,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition total for whatever came his way. That number matters, because roughly halfway through the fight this story is about to describe, 3 of those 4 guns were going to run dry. Ding Hao herself was still fitted with the original framed cockpit canopy of the early P-51B, the same design that had first flown over Europe just weeks earlier, the first bulging Malcolm Hood modification, giving the pilot a clearer view of the sky behind him, would not be fitted to Howard's aircraft until the spring of 1944. In January, he was flying with the older canopy, a layer of framed plexiglass overhead that produced blind spots directly behind the pilot's head. Blind spots that a determined enemy fighter could exploit if he knew how to use them. Howard knew about the blind spots, so he did not fly like a man who had them. He turned his head constantly, checked over each shoulder every few seconds, never let his eyes rest in one direction long enough for a threat to sneak in from another. The Mustang's speed at altitude was better than 400 miles an hour. Its climb rate, once it settled into its Merlin engine, could match anything the Germans put in the air. Its range, with drop tanks slung under the wings, could take a pilot from England to Berlin and back. And its handling, in the hands of a pilot who had learned to trust its quirks, was as responsive and forgiving as anything else in the Allied fighter inventory. The sky where Howard would meet the enemy was as merciless as the airplane was capable. 21,000 feet in a January winter over central Germany was somewhere between -40 and -50 degrees Fahrenheit inside a cockpit, heated by nothing more than what the engine could spare. Pilots wore silk gloves inside leather gloves. They wore heated flying suits that plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. They breathed through oxygen masks, connected to bottles that had to last the whole mission because the air at that altitude was too thin to support conscious thought for long without them. If your oxygen system failed, you had about 30 seconds before you started making the kinds of decisions that would kill you. There is a particular kind of death that came from oxygen failure at high altitude. It did not hurt. It did not warn you it was coming. The pilot simply became gradually confused, made a series of small mistakes, perhaps forgot for a moment where he was, perhaps forgot what he was doing there, and by the time anyone on the radio noticed, he had already flown his aircraft into the ocean below, or into another aircraft, or simply into a mountain. Some men were killed by German pilots. Others were killed by their own lungs, quietly, in the middle of a routine mission, with no enemy anywhere in sight. Below the fighters, the Earth rolled by at that strange, slow pace that only altitude can produce. Fields the size of postage stamps, rivers like fine silver threads, villages that a man could cover with his thumb held out at arm's length. The war from up there did not look like a war. It looked like a map, except when the enemy came. And on the morning of January 11th, 1944, the enemy came in numbers that no American pilot who had flown over Europe up to that point had ever quite faced alone. The morning of January 11th, 1944, began before the sun did. Ground crews worked by flashlight in the freezing dark, checking oil levels, arming machine guns, running fuel through cold lines that resisted the flow, breath fogged in front of every face, metal tools stuck to bare fingers if a man was careless enough to forget his gloves. 50 Mustangs sat dispersed around the airfield, engines silent, canopies beaded with frost that ground crews scraped away by hand before pilots ever reached the flight line. Howard walked out to Ding Hao in the gray pre-dawn light, parachute slung over one shoulder, and ran his eyes over the airplane the way he always did, checking the same details out of habit as much as necessity. The white letters near the cockpit had faded slightly since Burma, but they were still legible. Very good. Number 1. A small joke between himself and an airplane he had come to trust. Whatever the mess hall argument said about it, there is something to be said about the ritual of a pilot preparing to fly a combat mission before dawn. Whatever the war has done to him in the previous months, whatever sleep he did or did not get the night before, the ritual is the same. The walk to the airplane, the touch of the propeller, the last look up at a sky that will, in a few hours, contain things he cannot yet see. Every fighter pilot who ever climbed into a cockpit in a war zone did this. Some of them did it for the last time and did not know it. Howard did it that morning without any premonition of what was coming. Just another briefing. Another long escort. Another day of doing the job he had been trained for. The Merlin engine caught on the second try, coughing, then settling into a deep, steady growl that vibrated up through the airframe and into Howard's spine. One by one down the flight line, other engines answered. The formation taxied out in a slow, deliberate procession, wingtip to wingtip, exhaust stacks glowing faint blue in the darkness. Takeoff came in staggered pairs, aircraft lifting off the runway and disappearing into low cloud almost immediately, climbing on instruments toward a rendezvous point they could not yet see. Above the overcast, the sky opened into hard, clear blue. Howard leveled off, formed up his squadron, and turned east. Below him and slightly ahead, the bomber stream was already visible. An enormous procession of B-17 flying fortresses stacked in combat boxes that stretched for miles, contrails knitting the sky into pale ribbons. 3 full divisions were making the run that day. More than 500 heavy bombers in total, though Howard's 50 Mustangs would only ever cover a fraction of that formation directly. The target was the Flugzeugwerk at Oschersleben, a factory deep inside Germany where workers assembled Focke-Wulf 190 fighters bound for exactly the kind of unit that would soon be trying to kill the men flying to destroy it. A second force was bound for Halberstadt, not far away. There was one more thing about the mission that morning that made it particularly significant. Though most of the men flying it would not fully appreciate the fact until later. This was the first major operation under a new commander of the 8th Air Force, General James Harold Doolittle, the same Jimmy Doolittle who had led the audacious carrier-launched raid on Tokyo just 21 months earlier, had taken command only 5 days before. Oschersleben would be his introduction to the men he now led. Every bomber crew and every fighter pilot in the sky that morning knew, without being told, that the new man at the top of the 8th Air Force would be watching how they performed. And Doolittle, more than any previous commander, was a man who understood exactly what a single well-timed act of courage in the air could accomplish. He had, after all, built his own reputation on precisely that kind of act. James Howard was about to give Jimmy Doolittle a demonstration neither man could have scripted. The mission profile called for the fighters to escort the bombers to the target, hold position through the bomb run, and stay with the formation as it turned for home, the most dangerous phase of any deep penetration raid. German controllers on the ground had learned through bitter experience that American fighters tended to be aft lowest on fuel and most scattered in the minutes just after bombs fell. That was when the Luftwaffe struck hardest. Intelligence would later estimate that as many as 500 German fighters were airborne across central Germany that day, gathered specifically to defend factories the Reich could not afford to lose. Howard's squadron met the bomber stream on schedule, taking position above and around the lead elements of the 354th Fighter Group's assigned box. For a while, the mission proceeded almost exactly as briefed. Then the radio calls started. Bandits high, 12 o'clock, a formation of twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s, Zerstorer heavy fighters armed with rockets and cannon, designed specifically to break apart bomber formations from long range, was moving to attack. Howard led his flight into the intercept without hesitation. The 110 was a dangerous airplane against unescorted bombers. Its nose, heavy with cannon and rockets, built to shatter a bomber formation from outside the range of defensive guns. But it was a poor match for a Mustang in a turning fight. Too heavy, too slow to react. Howard closed on one of them, lined up his shot, and fired. Tracer rounds converged on the German fighter's fuselage. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. And then smoke began pouring from one engine, thick and black against the pale winter sky. The Messerschmitt rolled off and went down, trailing a widening smear of smoke toward the earth below. One confirmed kill, logged in the opening minutes of what was about to become the longest 30 minutes of James Howard's life. Though he had no way of knowing that yet. In that moment it was simply another engagement, the kind he had flown dozens of times before, over Burma, and now over Germany. But the intercept had scattered his formation. In the chaotic, twisting airspace above the bomber's stream, aircraft break apart from each other in seconds. One hard turn, one climb through cloud, and a tight formation becomes 6 or 8 individual airplanes scattered across miles of sky. Howard called for his wingman. No response. He called for his flight. Silence. Or garbled radio traffic from other engagements happening elsewhere in the same crowded airspace. He had done exactly what the mission required, engaged an immediate threat, and in doing so had lost contact with every other American fighter around him. Standard procedure in this situation was simple, and had been drilled into every pilot in the group. A lone fighter separated from formation, deep in German airspace, with bandits confirmed in the area, heads home, not out of cowardice, out of arithmetic. A single fighter had no wingman to watch his tail, no one to confirm a kill, no one to help if his engine took a hit 400 miles from the nearest cloud cover. The odds of a lone fighter surviving an extended engagement against multiple enemy aircraft, were poor enough that the rule existed precisely to keep pilots from testing them. Every squadron commander in the 8th Air Force had lost pilots who had ignored that rule, men who had chased one German fighter too far, or stayed to help one bomber too long. Their families received telegrams saying missing in action. Their names were spoken quietly at mess hall dinners for a few weeks, and then eventually stopped being spoken at all. That was the arithmetic behind the rule. That was why the rule existed. Howard climbed instead. He wanted altitude, and he wanted to know where his squadron had gone. What he found as he leveled off above the bomber formation was not his squadron. It was the bombers themselves, and they were dying. More than 30 German fighters, a mixed force of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, had converged on the B-17s from multiple directions at once. Howard would later say he had never seen anything like it. An entire sky thick with enemy aircraft, making pass after pass against a bomber formation that had no fighter cover left at all. Every other American escort had been drawn off, scattered, or was somewhere else entirely, fighting its own separate battle in a different pocket of the same enormous engagement. Howard scanned the sky in every direction, searching for even one other Mustang. There was none, as far as he could tell. In that particular patch of German sky, he was the only American fighter left. He had a choice, and every part of his training told him what the correct choice was supposed to be. He was alone. He was deep inside enemy territory, hundreds of miles from the English coast, with fuel gauges that would only allow so much margin for error. The enemy outnumbered him by more than 30 to 1, a ratio so lopsided it barely qualified as odds in any conventional sense. He could turn west, climb for altitude and speed, and be home in time for dinner. And no one, not his commanding officer, not the men flying those bombers, could have called it anything but sound judgment. 30 against 1 was not a fight. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not on his side. Below him, a B-17 took a hit and began trailing black smoke from an outboard engine. He watched a Focke-Wulf line up for a second pass on the same crippled bomber, the German pilot in no apparent hurry, confident that nothing in the sky could stop him. Every combat pilot faces a moment, at some point in his career, when the choice in front of him has no correct answer according to anything he was ever taught, when the manual has run out of relevant pages, when training has done everything it can do, and the rest is left to the man alone. Howard was in that moment, and the moment lasted perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3, long enough for one B-17 to absorb one more hit, long enough for one German pilot to line up one more attack run, long enough for James Howard, 30 years old, husband to no one, father to no one, alone 6 miles above a country, whose language he had learned to recognize on the wind in Canton as a boy, to make the choice that would define the rest of his life. Howard rolled Ding Hao over and dove. He came out of the dive at speed, picked the nearest enemy fighter, a Messerschmitt turning inside the bomber formation, and cut across its circle, cutting inside the German pilot's turn radius, the way he had learned years earlier, fighting Japanese fighters over Burma that could outturn anything American in the sky. He dropped 20 degrees of flap, tightening his own turn beyond what the airplane's clean configuration would normally allow, and forced the Messerschmitt to break off its attack and dive away rather than be caught in Howard's gun sight. It was not a kill. It did not need to be a kill. It broke the attack, and for one bomber in one moment, that was enough. Then he was moving to the next threat, and the one after that. What followed was not a single engagement so much as a continuous, rolling battle that would stretch on for more than 30 minutes, an eternity in air combat terms, where most engagements are measured in seconds. Howard fought in a widening, climbing, diving circle above and around the bomber formation, never settling into one fixed position, never giving any single German pilot time to set up a clean shot on him. He would dive on a fighter making a run at the bombers, force a break, climb hard to regain altitude and energy, spot the next threat, and dive again. The German pilots he faced were not inexperienced. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, or seasoned home defense pilots who had been intercepting American bomber formations for months. Men who had watched their own comrades die, learning the hard lessons Howard already carried with him from Burma. They understood formation tactics, understood how to work in pairs, understood how to bracket a target from two directions at once. Against a normal opponent, their numbers alone should have ended the fight in the first 60 seconds. But Howard refused to fight the fight they wanted. He never held a straight course long enough for two fighters to coordinate an attack on him specifically. Every time a pair of Messerschmitts moved to converge on his tail, he was already braking somewhere else, chasing a different threat, forcing individual German pilots to make individual decisions about whether engaging this one lone Mustang was worth the risk when there were still bombers to attack and a limited amount of fuel in every German fuel tank. The Mustang's advantages, the ones that had been debated so bitterly in the officers' mess only weeks earlier, were exactly what kept him alive now. Its speed let him disengage from one threat and reach another before German pilots could reposition. Its climb rate, so much better than anything Howard had flown in Burma, let him trade altitude for energy and then rebuild that altitude again almost as quickly as he spent it. The laminar flow wing that engineers had praised on paper was in the air above Oschersleben. The difference between catching an enemy fighter in time and watching a bomber die because he arrived a half-second too late. Cold seeped into the cockpit despite the heater, sweat freezing against the inside of his suit. Even as adrenaline kept his hands steady on the stick, his neck ached from the constant, unrelenting effort of checking every direction at once. A habit drilled into him so deeply over Burma that it had become closer to instinct than conscious thought. There was no time to be afraid in any way that showed on the outside. The fear lived somewhere underneath the flying, present in the dryness of his mouth and the tightness in his chest, but never allowed to slow his hands or narrow his focus. If you have never experienced serious G-forces, there is no way to describe them accurately. It is not like a fast elevator or a roller coaster. It is like having a truck sitting on your chest. Your face sags. Your arms feel like they weigh 100 pounds each. Blood drains out of your head down toward your feet, and your vision goes gray at the edges as your brain runs short of oxygen. In a hard sustained turn at 6 or 7 times normal gravity, a pilot has perhaps 10 or 15 seconds before he blacks out entirely. And blacking out at 6 miles high, with an enemy on your tail, is not something a man recovers from. Howard had spent thousands of hours learning to fly at the very edge of that limit, learning to grunt against it, tense his stomach muscles, hold on for one more second than the man he was fighting. It was not glamorous. It was physical work at the far edge of human endurance. Down below, inside the B-17s, gunners tracked the battle through frost-rimmed wastes and ball turret sights, watching a single American fighter appear again and again in different parts of the sky, driving off attack after attack, never seeming to rest. The temperature inside an unpressurized B-17 at that altitude hovered well below freezing, and gunners worked their weapons with fingers gone stiff and clumsy inside heavy gloves, breath crystallizing on the inside of their oxygen masks, eyes stinging from the glare of sun on cloud. Radio discipline in the bomber formations had mostly collapsed into a chorus of shouted warnings and disbelieving commentary. The leader of the bomber formation put it plainly in his own after-action report. It looked like one American against the entire Luftwaffe, he said. He was over us, and across the formations, and around it. So relentless and so widespread was the single airplane's presence that Fortress crews could scarcely believe it was the same Mustang every time. Men who had spent the mission bracing for the end, watching German fighters queue up for runs at their own aircraft, found themselves instead watching a silver shape roll in from an unexpected angle, guns flashing, breaking the attack apart before it ever reached them. Some crewmen crossed themselves. Others simply watched, unable to look away, trying to hold on to the sight of it in case no one back at base believed what they were about to report. Every one of those bomber crewmen was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's husband in a small town in Ohio or Nebraska or Alabama, where a mother was that very morning setting out plates for a breakfast her boy would not eat for many more months. If ever, those men were living, in that moment, on borrowed time. Time borrowed from a lone Mustang pilot who had made a decision no one had asked him to make. Howard's ammunition, loaded before dawn into 4 wing-mounted machine guns, was not unlimited. Somewhere past the 20-minute mark, 3 of his 4 functioning guns ran dry, chewed through in burst after burst against target after target. A pilot with fewer options might have called that the natural end of his usefulness in the fight, and turned for home with a clear conscience. Howard did not. He kept diving. An airplane with empty guns still looks, from the cockpit of an approaching Messerschmitt, exactly like an airplane with full guns, right up until the moment it opens fire and nothing happens. Howard used that uncertainty as a weapon. He dove on German fighters making runs at the bombers, lined up as though preparing to fire, and forced pilot after pilot to break off the attack, rather than gamble that the diving Mustang behind them was actually out of ammunition. Some of those bluffs worked exactly as he hoped, sending German fighters peeling away, rather than risk a fight they could not be certain they would win. It was not marksmanship anymore. It was theater, performed at 400 miles an hour with a dwindling fuel gauge and a windscreen already scarred by near misses. And it was, in its own way, just as effective as the gunfire that had come before it. There was a particular kind of discipline required to keep flying that way, throwing an unarmed airplane at enemy fighters over and over, trusting that hesitation and uncertainty in another man's mind would do the work that bullets could no longer do. A pilot with less experience might have broken off the moment his guns went silent, might have decided that an empty airplane had no further business anywhere near 30 enemy fighters. Howard's years in Burma had taught him something about the psychology of a fight that no gunnery manual ever wrote down directly. That a formation, under pressure, uncertain of what it is actually facing, will often lose more cohesion from doubt than from casualties. Every German pilot who broke off a run rather than test whether Howard's guns were truly empty was, in that instant, thinking about his own survival instead of the bomber in his sights. That was the entire purpose. It did not need to look impressive from the ground. It only needed to work. The fight carried Howard from over 20,000 feet down through open air and cloud and back up again. A rolling, exhausting battle of energy and altitude that left no time to check a watch, no time to do anything but fly, react, and fly again. He would later be able to give only a fragmented account of the engagement's exact sequence. A natural consequence of 30 minutes spent almost entirely on the edge of what both and airplane could endure. His gun camera, mounted to record his own attacks, ran through its film reel partway through the fight, meaning even his own airplane's evidence would only ever capture a portion of what actually happened above Oschersleben that afternoon. What was not in doubt to the 16 separate bomber crews who filed independent combat reports after landing that evening was that a lone American fighter had stood between them and the German Air Force for what felt to men already exhausted by hours of formation flying in flak, like the better part of an hour. Waist gunners who had resigned themselves to not making it home watched instead as attack after attack broke apart before reaching effective firing range. Ball turret gunners tracked a silver fighter, looping and diving through formations of enemy aircraft that outnumbered it more than 30-1, and kept firing themselves whenever a clean shot presented itself, adding their own .50 caliber fire to whatever protection Howard's presence provided. For the German pilots circling above Oschersleben that afternoon, the engagement must have made less and less sense the longer it continued. They had come to destroy an undefended bomber formation, a task that, moments before Howard arrived, had looked almost routine. Instead, they found themselves repeatedly broken off from their attack runs by a single aircraft that refused to stay in one place long enough to be cornered, that dove out of the sun from directions no one expected, that seemed impossibly to be everywhere at once. Some German pilots pressed their attacks regardless, unwilling to let one lone Mustang dictate the outcome of a battle they still, on paper, controlled by an overwhelming margin. Others grew visibly more cautious, breaking off runs earlier than they needed to, wary of a threat they could not quite predict. There is a psychological principle in air combat that older fighter pilots understood in their bones and never bothered to write down in any manual. Numerical superiority stops meaning anything the moment individual pilots lose their willingness to press the attack. 30 fighters flown with hesitation are not 30 fighters. They are 30 individual men, each making a private decision about whether the next attack is worth the risk. And when even a few of them decide it is not, the coordination that made them 30 in the first place begins to unravel. That is what Howard was doing above Oschersleben. Not shooting down 30 aircraft. He could not have. He did not have the ammunition, and probably would not have had the fuel. And even at his best, he was not going to defeat that many pilots on skill alone. What he was doing was making 30 individual German pilots question, one after another, whether pressing the next attack was worth it. And enough of them, over the course of that 30 minutes, decided that it was not. Eventually, as fuel ran low on both sides of the fight, the German attacks began to thin. Some Luftwaffe pilots, low on fuel themselves after an extended engagement, broke off and turned for their own airfields. Others simply seemed to lose the appetite for pressing home an attack against a bomber formation that, thanks to one increasingly battered Mustang, no longer looked like easy prey. Howard, guns empty, fuel gauge reading dangerously low, stayed with the bombers as long as he reasonably could, climbing back to altitude one final time to confirm the German fighters were breaking contact, before finally turning Ding Hao west toward England, toward home, toward an airfield he was no longer entirely certain he had enough fuel to reach. The B-17s of the 401st Bomb Group continued on, damaged, some trailing smoke, some carrying wounded men in their fuselages, but continued in formation, toward the English coast. Behind them, scattered across the sky over central Germany, lay the wreckage of an attack that had, by any reasonable measure, been broken by one airplane and one pilot who had chosen, at the exact moment it would have been easiest and most defensible to leave, to turn around instead. Howard's own flight home was quieter than the battle had been, but no less tense. The adrenaline that had carried him through 30 minutes of continuous combat began to drain away somewhere over the North Sea, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made his arms feel heavy on the controls. His fuel gauge sat low enough that he found himself doing the same silent arithmetic every pilot on a long-range mission learns to do without thinking, converting the distance remaining into minutes, the minutes into gallons, watching the numbers narrow toward each other with a patience that was really just an absence of any other option. The English coastline appeared beneath a layer of broken cloud sooner than he had let himself hope for. He picked up the outline of his own airfield, brought Ding Hao around into the landing pattern, and set the Mustang down on a runway still slick with the morning's frost. The engine that had carried him across 500 miles of hostile sky finally allowed to idle down to silence. Ground crew met him on the taxiway, the way they always did, breath fogging in the cold morning air, counting airplanes back onto the field one by one and comparing the count against the number that had left before dawn. Howard climbed out slowly, his legs unsteady after hours, folded into the same cramped position, and stood for a moment beside the airplane before anyone thought to ask him anything. There would be time later for debriefing, for reports, for the paperwork that turned a battle into an official record. In that first quiet minute on the ground, there was only the cold morning air, the sound of other engines still shutting down around the field, and the particular disbelieving relief of a man who had not, by any reasonable calculation, expected to make it back. By that evening, intelligence officers at the 401st Bomb Group's base at Dinathorpe were sitting through debriefing after debriefing, listening to bomber crews describe the same event from 16 separate, independent vantage points. The debriefing huts were crowded and loud, thick with cigarette smoke, and the particular jittery energy of men who had survived something they had genuinely not expected to survive. Coffee went cold in chipped tin cups while exhausted crews waited their turn to talk, still wearing heavy flight jackets in the overheated hut. Waist gunners, ball turret gunners, navigators, pilots, men who had never spoken to each other during the mission, and would not compare notes until they were already seated across from an intelligence officer with a notepad, kept describing the same impossible thing. One American fighter, alone, diving again and again into a formation of more than 30 German aircraft, for what felt to every single one of them like the better part of an hour. The intelligence officers, accustomed to accounts that varied wildly from crew to crew, even when describing the same few minutes of a shared mission, found themselves instead compiling report after report that lined up almost perfectly, an unusual and telling kind of consistency that made the story, however extraordinary, difficult to dismiss as exaggerations or the fog of combat playing tricks on frightened men. The lead pilot of the bomber formation did not mince words in his own report. For sheer guts and determination, he said, it was the greatest exhibition he had ever seen. They cannot give that boy a big enough award. Major Allison Brooks, who had led the 401st's contribution to the mission and watched much of the engagement unfold from his own cockpit, used a phrase that would follow James Howard for the rest of his life. And long after it, a one-man Air Force, Brooks called him afterward. Unable to find any more conventional way to describe what he had just watched a single Mustang accomplish against odds that should not have allowed it to survive, let alone prevail. Howard's own account of the engagement, filed through official channels in the days that followed, was notably more modest than the version already spreading through the bomber crew's retellings. He confirmed the Messerschmitt 110 shot down in the opening minutes of the fight. Beyond that, the Medal of Honor citation that would eventually be issued in his name would credit him with 2 additional confirmed kills, 2 probable kills, and damaging at least several more. 3 confirmed, 2 probable, damaged others. That was the official accounting. The bomber crews, who had watched him work, exhausted and grateful, and in some cases still trembling with adrenaline of their own, insisted the true number was higher. 4, some said. 5, said others. A handful of accounts pushed the total as high as 6. His own gun camera, which might have settled the question definitively, had run out of film partway through the engagement, leaving even the most objective evidence available incomplete. To this day, historians citing different sources will give different final numbers for James Howard's kills that afternoon over Oschersleben. And the honest answer is that no one can say with total certainty which count is correct. What is certain, confirmed independently by more witnesses than almost any other single action of the air war over Europe, is that one Mustang held off more than 30 German fighters for over half an hour, and that every single B-17 those fighters had been sent to destroy made it home. News of the engagement moved quickly. Within a week, Howard was in London, seated at a press conference in front of 100 reporters. Among them was a young CBS correspondent named Walter Cronkite, who would go on to become the most trusted source in American journalism. and a young Stars and Stripes reporter named Andy Rooney, who would spend the next 50 years telling stories to audiences that would number in the tens of millions. Both men were there in that London room in January of 1944 to listen to a quiet major from Missouri describe a fight that most of them could barely visualize. The Saturday Evening Post ran the story. Popular Science ran it. True Magazine ran it. Hundreds of newspapers across the free world picked it up and put the photograph of Howard beside his Mustang on their front pages. Howard became an overnight sensation. He was not comfortable with any of it. The quiet major from the American Volunteer Group, the man who had spent 2 years in Burma flying missions no American newspaper had ever covered, was suddenly the face of the strategic bombing campaign in Europe. Photographed, interviewed, held up as the answer to every question about whether the Mustang could really do what its promoters said it could. He answered the questions carefully, modestly, without embellishment, trying, in his own quiet way, to shift the credit back to the airplane, to his squadron, to the bomber crews who had, in his telling, done far more than he had. If you have ever met a man who genuinely accomplished something extraordinary in his youth and then spent the rest of his life declining to talk about it, you have some sense of James Howard. The kind of quiet that is not shyness, not modesty in the false sense, but the settled understanding of a man who knows exactly what he did and does not need anyone to remind him of it. The recognition that followed the London press conference was not immediate in official terms. Military honors of that magnitude moved through layers of review, verification, paperwork, gathering statements from bomber crews, cross-referencing what could be confirmed against what remained only probable, building a case that could withstand the scrutiny such an extraordinary claim demanded. It was not until June of 1944, 5 months after the engagement itself, that the honor became official. General Order No. 45 was issued from Washington on the 5th of June. 22 days later, on the 27th of June 1944, General Carl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, formally presented James Howard with the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States government can bestow. The ceremony took place in England, a comparatively small and formal affair, against the backdrop of a war that by June of that year had already moved on to the invasion of Normandy and 100 other urgent priorities. Howard stood at attention while the citation was read aloud. A formal accounting, in the flat language of military records, of 30 minutes that no formal language could really capture. The citation described a pilot who had chosen, alone and heavily outnumbered, to attack rather than withdraw, and who had, through that choice, prevented what should have been a catastrophic loss of American bombers and American lives. He remains to this day the only fighter pilot to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in the European theater during the entire Second World War. Bomber crews receive the award more frequently. Recognition of the extraordinary casualty traits men faced simply by climbing into a B-17 or B-24 and flying toward Germany. Fighter pilots, by the nature of their work, more often received the Distinguished Service Cross or the Silver Star. Howard's Medal of Honor stood, and still stands, alone among fighter pilots who flew over Europe, a measure of just how far outside ordinary experience his 30 minutes above Oschersleben had fallen. Here is something most retellings of this story leave out. Howard was not even the highest scoring ace of his own fighter group. Pilots like Glenn Eagleston, Don Bierbauer, and Jack Bradley all finished the war with more confirmed aerial victories than James Howard did. In pure numerical terms, they were the aces of the pioneer Mustang group. But it was Howard who received the Medal of Honor, because what matters in the end is not always the number of victories. Sometimes it is one single afternoon, when a man made a choice that no one could have blamed him for making differently. There is one more thing about James Howard that most tellings of this story leave out as well. He was an ace of two theaters. 6 confirmed kills against Japanese aircraft in Burma with the Flying Tigers, 6 confirmed kills against German aircraft in Europe with the 9th Air Force, 12 confirmed victories total, divided almost perfectly between the two ends of the war. That number puts him in a group of American pilots so small it can be counted on the fingers of a single hand. Men who fought and killed in the skies over Asia and the skies over Europe. Men who saw 2 wars from the cockpit and returned home from both. Most Americans have never heard his name. He was too quiet for the newsreels to make him a permanent household figure, and too disciplined to promote himself in the post-war decades when other pilots became famous for talking about what they had done. But the record is the record. Howard was promoted in the aftermath of the action to lieutenant colonel, just weeks after the engagement. He continued flying and commanding for the remainder of the war. He did not talk about the engagement often in the years that followed, in the manner of many men of his generation who had done something extraordinary and preferred, once it was over, to simply get on with the rest of their lives. By most accounts, he preferred to answer questions about Oschersleben briefly and without embellishment, more at ease discussing tactics and airplane performance than his own role in the story. A reticence that stood in sharp contrast to how large the engagement loomed in the memories of every bomber crewman who had watched it unfold from below. He remained in military service after the war ended, continuing a career that had already carried him from a Navy carrier deck to a mercenary squadron in Burma to the skies over Nazi Germany. Few American officers of his generation could claim service across 3 such different chapters of military aviation. Biplanes launching off a carrier deck in the years before the war. A foreign air force fighting under a flag that was not officially at war with anyone. And finally, the largest and most technologically advanced air campaign the world had yet seen. He eventually retired from the United States Air Force in 1966 with the rank of Brigadier General, a career capped by, but never entirely defined by, the 30 minutes that had made him famous. In the years between his retirement and his death, Howard settled quietly into civilian life. He lived in Florida. He wrote a memoir. He gave the occasional interview when a persistent journalist tracked him down, but never seemed to enjoy the attention. He watched the aviation industry he had helped shape continue to advance through decades. He could not have predicted when he first strapped into a biplane in Pensacola. Jet fighters replaced by supersonic jets. Piston engines relegated to museum exhibits. His generation of pilots slowly thinning until the men who had actually flown Mustangs in combat could be counted in a single hangar at a reunion. James Howell Howard died on the 18th of March, 1995, at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center at Bay Pines, Florida. He was 81 years old. He had lived in Bel Air Bluffs, Florida, in the quiet retirement years of a man who had, in his own way, done enough. He had lived through the entire arc of American military aviation, from open cockpit biplanes to the jet age. He had flown a Navy biplane off a carrier deck before most of his eventual squadron mates had ever seen an airplane up close. And he had lived long enough to watch supersonic jets and eventually spacecraft carry that same aviation lineage forward into territory no one at Pensacola in 1938 could have imagined. The airplane he flew that January afternoon, the P-51 Mustang, once dismissed by some of his own men as unreliable and unforgiving, went on to become perhaps the single most celebrated American fighter of the Second World War, credited across the entire conflict with a kill ratio against enemy aircraft that few other Allied fighters could match. It escorted bombers to Berlin and back, hunted German aircraft on the ground at airfields deep inside the Reich, and by the summer of 1944 had become the airplane fighter pilots requested rather than dreaded, the same fuel system pilots had once distrusted, the same narrow landing gear that had unsettled veterans used to the rugged Thunderbolt, became footnotes in a much larger story about range, speed, and an engine that could fight at altitudes German pilots had once considered safe. None of that reputation was inevitable. Airplanes do not build their own legends. Pilots do, one mission at a time. And on one January afternoon in 1944, a single P-51, named for two Chinese characters meaning very good, climbed alone into a formation of more than 30 enemy fighters. Because the alternative was watching bombers die, with no one left to help them. 16 separate bomber crews wrote down what they saw, because they were afraid no one would otherwise believe it. The men Howard protected that day went on to fly further missions, some of them completing full tours and returning home to families who would never fully understand what those 30 minutes over Oschersleben had meant. Most of them had never seen his face and would not have recognized him on the ground. A lone silver fighter glimpsed only at a distance through frosted glass, in the middle of the worst hour of their war. History remembers it more simply, as the day one man became. For 30 extraordinary minutes, an entire Air Force. Take a moment to think about what your life has taught you about the difference between men who talk about what they have done and men who do not. James Howard was the second kind. He came from a generation that produced a great many of the second kind. Men who saw and did things that would have made lesser men famous, and instead came home and became insurance salesmen, ran hardware stores, coached Little League, raised families in small houses in small towns, and never mentioned the war unless someone asked, and often not even then. Every one of those men carried inside them something like what James Howard carried. Some private memory of a moment when they had done what needed to be done, and no one had been there to see it, and no medal had ever recognized it, and yet they had done it anyway. Fathers, uncles, grandfathers, neighbors down the street who mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and rarely raised their voices. There were so many of them once. There are so few of them now. The generation that produced James Howard is very nearly gone. The last combat veterans of the Second World War are in their late 90s or past 100 years old. Every week, another name that once appeared in a squadron roster is added to a memorial wall somewhere. Every week, another attic somewhere in America is opened by a grandson going through his grandfather's papers, and another folded flag, and another set of medals, and another handful of yellowed photographs come out of a shoebox, and someone in a family learns for the first time what the quiet old man they buried last year had actually done in his youth. That is why stories like this one matter. Not because they make heroes out of men who never asked to be heroes, but because they honor the choice those men made in a moment no one could have made for them, and then quietly declined to talk about for the rest of their lives. If your father or your grandfather flew in the 8th or 9th Air Force, whether he was a pilot or a bombardier or a navigator or a mechanic, whether he flew from Boxted or Denethorpe or any of the dozens of American airfields scattered across the fields of eastern England, leave his name and his unit in the comments below. Those men are named far less often than they earned. If you have ever stood next to a P-51 Mustang in a museum, tell us what you saw. If you have ever read James Howard's memoir or heard him speak, tell us what you took away from him. Pilots got the newsreel. The ones who did not come home got the crosses. And a quiet major from Missouri, born in a Chinese port city, kidnapped by bandits as a boy, released his commission for a mercenary war 6 months before Pearl Harbor, told the story straight for the rest of his life, and then he too finally rested. Ding Hao flies now only in museums and in memory, but she flies still,